Okay, so good evening, everyone. Really happy that you're able to join tonight for the feeding skills presentation. This is it's got to be one of my favorite topics because it's really tricky. Picky eating is a tricky topic, and I love it because there's so much variability between families because it takes into account feeding styles, eating habits, cultural beliefs and beliefs around eating. And so I always find it such a stimulating conversation, and I learn a lot myself as well. So tonight, this is called Feeding Skills, Creating a Better Eater. And I usually use this title when I talk about feeding skills because really what we're doing is we're working towards progress with our kids, right? We're not going to have this maybe an eater that's exactly the way we want her, that's going to eat exactly the way we're going to eat. But we're hoping that they're going to be a little bit better every time we try strategies. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about eating skills, the development of eating skills. I think this is something that's important to know, even if your child is not at all in this age range, your child is older. Eating is a skill. It really is a skill. And, I have many parents tell me, it's eating, everybody eats, why is it so hard? Because it is a skill, and it requires so many levels and integration of abilities. Our motor abilities, our cognitive, emotional, so many things are involved in eating. So I thought it would be worthwhile just to go through a few of the eating skills and the milestones. So I'm going to start at around 6 to 9 months because that's when the average age of weaning starts to happen. But you might see your baby have interest in food even as early as 4 months. Your baby might start looking at what you're eating. So around 6 months, they might want some help if you're giving them some solid foods. They're starting to grasp large crackers and cookies. They have that really crude raking grasp, and so they can grasp onto those big things like spoons. They might start to bang. They might start using 2 hands together, and you're seeing some of that interest and that development of grasping and eating come together. Around 9 to 13 months, you might start to see them feed themselves soft or melty foods. They're starting to really enjoy finger eating around that 1 year mark. But actually, I see it a lot earlier. And they can handle small items like raisins or Cheerios. So they're moving out of that crude, large grasp with all the fingers to finger isolation. So they're able to separate their fingers, and they're having fun grabbing those small things. So around that year mark, you'll start to see them dip food in spoon and bring a lotus spoon to their mouth, but they're still messy. So this is an area that gets a little bit tricky. I definitely across cultures, some parents or the child spending a lot of time with grandparents, they do not have the child use a spoon. Actually, the parents may still be feeding the child with the spoon. So that's something that I try to keep in mind as I'm working with families or in schools when some kids come into school and the school team is saying, oh, the child is still, at this age and not feeding with a spoon. But sometimes culturally, they're just not doing that in the home. And I know for myself too, I mean, I have young kids, and my parents were feeding my kids with a spoon much later than I would have. So just something to keep in mind too. So around 15 to 18 months, or that year and a half mark, the kids are getting better at their eye-hand coordination. They're picking up with the spoon. They're able to rotate their hand and bring the spoon to their mouth instead of, keeping their forearm pronated down this way. And so all the food drops off the spoon, which you will see at an earlier age. But this is when they're getting much more coordinated, and they're getting a much better sense of competence. And so when they have the competence with eating, then it's much, much more motivating. So they're wanting to feed themselves, and the movements are a lot more efficient. You're not seeing them pick up the spoon and, you know, turning it all ways, or, you know, dumping it on the floor or whatever. You're not seeing it that as much. They're eating with much more purpose. And then around getting close to the 2-year mark, it could, you know, there's a variability in this range. The kids want to feed themselves. They may even reject their parents' help. Actually, that probably happens a lot for a lot of things at around 2, and they insist on being independent. So, you know, you're giving that bowl of chicken soup, and you're going, oh, you know, just let me help you because it's going to end up on the floor. And they're going, no. So, but that's a really good sign, because you can see that the independence is coming. Or then around 2 to 3 years, then you may start introducing a fork. They're stabbing with a fork, and they're much more coordinated with a spoon. So you're seeing that eating competence and the motor skills really coming together. And around 3 to 5 years, then you're seeing a lot more independent eating. And children are developing their bilateral skills. So that's using both sides of their body together. And in the case of eating, it's using 2 hands together. So they're able to stabilize the fork, like let's say a pancake or something, stabilize the fork with one hand and use a knife in the other hand, and moving the other hand. And we want to see bilateral coordination skills in a lot of areas at this age. We want to see them, you know, be able to use one hand to hold their paper still and use the other hand to write. We want to see them hold their paper with one hand still, and then cut with the other hand. So, so this really ties into other tasks as well that they're doing at school. And so eating is such a wonderful life skill, you know, with utensils, and it just really transfers over to other areas in learning. So, so that's why it's so important. So alternatives. Now, I'm not sure if anybody out there, you know, has kids that have gone through alternative methods of feeding, like NG tube or a G tube, but I'll just touch on those briefly. Sometimes I'll work with kids at school, but usually we'll need training from a nurse or a nurse practitioner to help us use NG tubes or G tubes. NG tubes are generally for a shorter period of time, and however, a child needs to not do oral feeding for longer than they might use a G tube, but we can still work towards oral feeding. It just takes a much more specialized approach, and usually done in conjunction with a feeding team at the hospital. So I won't touch too much on that. Just wanted to put it out there, because I also wanted to include those kids that are using alternate means of feeding. And if anybody has questions about this, or has gone through this, or is going through this, please let me know in the question section. Yeah, so I wanted to cover all of those just briefly, because again, you know, the question that I get so many times is, oh, you know, why is this eating thing so hard? And it is really hard. It's, you know, it's intuitive for kids to want to eat, to want to explore that type of food, but when it comes down to it, it is a skill that needs to be taught. So it's an integration of many systems. You need to have good postural control, right? So if your child is sitting at the table and they're too busy focusing on just staying upright, then the food is not going to be as interesting, or they're not able to hold themselves up, and so swallowing becomes a problem if they're hunched over, for example. So you have to worry about posture control. That should be something that's automatic. If it's not automatic, then you're going to have issues with feeding. Oral motor skills. So being able to chew, to move your tongue around, to move the food into a bolus and move it around, to be able to do the suck, swallow, breathe, and coordinate all those systems, right? You know, sometimes children have trouble coordinating that basic, that suck, swallow, breathe. And so all of these things are happening together, or they're not sure how to sequence these things, these tasks. And so the oral motor skills could be an issue of why eating skills are difficult. Fine motor skills, as we've covered in the previous slides, being able to hold these different utensils, being able to pick up this food, not drop the food, right? Hand-eye coordination, bring it to your mouth without getting it on your clothes, without dropping it on the floor, and to know what you're doing without having to look. And then one of the biggest reasons, or the reasons that I like to focus on, because this is a topic that's close to my heart, is the ability to regulate your senses. So sensory regulation. This is one of the tasks that I think the only a task that we do that uses every single sense, right? Because eating is the other sense that we don't use with so many other activities that we do. We might use all our senses in, like play therapy and all that kind of those kinds of activities, but we're not eating those things. And so eating is the only one that we use all those senses, including interoception. And interoception is is your internal sense of feeling that hunger, feeling that thirst, and knowing that you feel that, right? And some kids with a weak sensory system, and we'll get more into this a little bit later on, so I can talk a little bit more about that, the sensory system's role in feeding. But if we have kids who are not feeling the thirst and not feeling the hunger, then they're not going to want to eat. Or they feel those things, but they actually don't know that that's what they're feeling, right? There's I don't know if you work with other kids or if your own child, you see them have this meltdown or they're really irritable, and it's like, oh, you were hungry, oh, you needed some water, right? It's that they feel something, but they're not able to verbalize it or just really understand it. Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit about picky eating versus problem feeding. A lot of kids are picky. A lot of kids are picky because actually it's a survival mechanism. We want to be able to, know that a food is bad, that it's poisonous, that it's not good for us through our sense of taste and our sense of smell. And so being picky, right, when you get to that age of independence around 2, then kids are going to be more picky, perhaps, and drop foods that they have eaten before, and that's perfectly normal because they're building their sense of autonomy, but they're also building in those survival skills. So what does picky eating look like? They eat at least 30 different foods. They tend to eat at least one food from each food group. They typically tolerate new foods being near them, even if they refuse to try them. And after a food jag, so let's say they've been eating the same food for a long time, they might agree to accept it again after a little break. Sometimes I know as parents, we could get into the trap of going, oh, well, they really love that food, so we're going to give it to them all the time. After a food jag, they might drop it, but then they're willing to accept it again. So that is, in sense, being a picky eater. And so if you look at that description, you would say, pretty much all kids are picky eaters because, they see new things and they're going, oh no, I don't want to try that. So a lot of kids are picky eaters, but what are the problem feeders? Problem feeders, they usually eat less than 20 foods. They will refuse entire food groups. They'll cry, protest when presented with new foods. And after they've given up a food, they permanently refuse to eat that food again. So that's when you have a problem feeder. So I think it's important to distinguish the two. And then after, even sometimes when I talk to parents after seeing this list, they're like, oh, actually, it's not. My child is not a problem feeder. Maybe they're just a little bit picky. But in general, my take on it is that if it's causing a problem for you and your family, and it's something that you want to work on, then it is a problem. It's something that we can always address. So I'm not saying this to say, oh, what, your kid eats more than at least 30 foods. Don't worry about it. No, it is personal to you and your problem. So if your child does eat 30 foods, but you want them to try new things and you want them to try certain things, and it is a problem to you, then it's definitely worth looking at. Okay, so I'm just gonna pause there and see if anybody has questions so far with just the general outline of the different milestones that we talked about before I move on to some of that, the nitty-gritty of strategies. Yeah, does anybody have